Xavier Shaw, a successful black CEO, faces intense racial prejudice and systemic corruption when he visits the small town of Millbrooke. As he navigates the town, he's met with judgment, condescension, and suspicion, particularly from Officer Daniels, who embodies the town's deeply ingrained racism. Xavier's attempts to stand against the biased system are met with escalating hostility, as Daniels and the local power structure aim to silence him. Despite gathering evidence of corruption, Xavier finds himself battling not just for his reputation, but against a system designed to keep people like him oppressed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets of Millbrooke. It was a town that felt suspended in time, as if it had been left behind by the fast pace of the world. Small shops with peeling signs lined the main street, and the smell of fresh-baked bread and fried food hung in the air. There was comfort here, but also a certain weight, the kind that came from years of unspoken rules and the invisible lines that divided those who belonged and those who didn't. Xavier Shaw was a man who didn't belong in places like this, and yet, here he was. The CEO of one of the country's most successful tech companies. He could have chosen to spend his afternoon in a sleek downtown cafe or at an exclusive private club. But instead, he had driven 60 miles to Millbrooke, a town that seemed as far from his world as any place could be. He walked into Joe's diner, the small bell above the door jingling softly as he entered. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like everyone was watching you, even if they weren't. Xavier was used to attention, but not this kind. The diner's warm, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural glow on the checkered floor and faded booths. The smell of bacon and grease mixed with the clink of coffee cups and the soft hum of a country song playing faintly in the background. Xavier's presence was immediately noticed. He didn't exactly stand out in a flashy way. His clothes were simple, a navy button-down shirt and a pair of dark jeans, but his polished shoes and the faintly expensive watch peeking from under his sleeve betrayed his wealth. A few heads turned, their gazes lingering longer than they should. Some faces were curious, others skeptical. A waitress, mid-30s with a short bob and a stern look, approached him. She was polite but distant, her smile just a little too tight. "Table for one?" she asked, her eyes flicking to his face and then down to his clothes, trying to place him in the mental hierarchy of the town. Xavier nodded. "Just a seat by the window, please." She hesitated for just a moment before gesturing toward a booth in the corner. "Right this way." As they walked, Xavier couldn't help but notice the looks that followed him. The town wasn't used to people like him. Not the way he was dressed, at least. And certainly not the way he carried himself. An air of confidence that wasn't born from arrogance, but from something else. A calmness, a steadiness. The quiet strength that came from years of building something from nothing, from rising above the odds that so many had set for him. He slid into the booth, the seat worn but comfortable. The waitress handed him a menu and walked away without another word. Xavier wasn't in the mood for anything elaborate. He just needed to think, to clear his mind, before the real reason for his visit began. As he scanned the menu, his eyes caught the reflection of a man standing outside the window. He looked familiar, but it wasn't until the man stepped closer that Xavier realized it was Officer Daniels, the town's local cop. Officer Daniels was a man whose reputation preceded him, at least in Millbrooke. He wasn't the kind of person who would let a black man, particularly one like Xavier, forget where he came from. Xavier didn't react. He had been used to people like Daniels for most of his life, people who had never quite believed he deserved the success he'd worked for. But he wasn't here to fight that battle. Not yet, not today. He had a different purpose in mind. A moment later, Daniels walked in, a slow and deliberate pace that seemed calculated. He didn't glance at Xavier immediately, but Xavier could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. It wasn't until Daniels approached the counter to place his order that he turned his gaze toward Xavier, meeting his eyes for a split second, before looking away. Xavier's fingers tightened around the menu. There it was. The invisible wall that separated the haves from the have-nots, the locals from the outsiders. He had seen it before, in boardrooms and offices, but it was different here. It was less subtle, more openly hostile, and it was inescapable. The waitress returned, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. She didn't say anything at first, just placed the cup with a slight thud on the table. Xavier looked up, meeting her eyes. Her expression was the same, polite, but distant. "You need anything else?" she asked, her tone not unkind, but laced with something unspoken. "No. This is fine," Xavier replied, his voice steady, though his mind was already elsewhere. He took a sip of the coffee, letting the heat seep into him. There was something about this place, something about this town that felt suffocating. The air, heavy with unspoken judgments, seemed to press in on him from all sides. Even the coffee tasted different here. Bitter. A reflection of everything he had fought to overcome. From the corner of his eye, he saw Officer Daniels take a seat at the counter, his back turned to Xavier. But the officer's posture was rigid, his shoulders stiff. Xavier knew Daniels wasn't unaware of his presence. Even though he didn't acknowledge him, the tension in the diner was palpable, thick with unsaid words. A few moments passed before the door to the diner opened again. This time, it was a woman, young, maybe in her mid-20s. She walked in with a purpose, her heels clicking on the tile floor as she passed through the door. She wore a tailored suit, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like she had been told, all her life, that she belonged. She made her way to the counter, without sparing a glance for Xavier, her heels tapping sharply as she moved. But the moment she stepped up to the counter, Daniels turned in his seat, giving her a nod of recognition. She smiled back, a quick but genuine exchange. And just like that, the air in the room seemed to shift. Xavier watched them for a moment, the subtle exchange not lost on him. His fingers curled around his cup once more, his mind racing. It wasn't lost on him that in this small town, in this diner, the dynamics were always the same. Daniels was comfortable here. He belonged. He had the support of people who saw him for what he was, an extension of their way of life, their unspoken rules. Xavier wasn't an outsider here. No, he was something worse. He was the reminder that people like Daniels, people like the woman at the counter, weren't the only ones who could win. That sometimes, a black man could rise to the top too. The woman at the counter ordered her coffee, paid without hesitation, and left. The entire exchange lasted no more than a few minutes, but the effect it had on the room was lasting. The people who had been whispering, the ones who had been casting sideways glances at Xavier, seemed to relax a little. The tension seemed to lessen. After all, the woman was just another customer, wasn't she? No need to wonder why she was there, right? But Xavier knew better. He knew the assumptions people were making, and for a brief moment, he considered letting it go, letting them all think whatever they wanted. He could walk out, get in his car, and never come back to this town again. But that wasn't why he was here. That wasn't why he had come all this way. Xavier sat back in his booth, his hand running along the edge of the table. He had a purpose today, not just for himself, but for something bigger than that. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew that he would face opposition, but he had to do it. It was time to challenge the assumptions. And so, as the clock on the wall ticked steadily onward, Xavier Shaw took a deep breath and prepared to stand up. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or cast aside. He had arrived in Millbrooke to confront more than just a few uncomfortable glances. Today, he was here to make a statement. The silence in the diner deepened as he stood, slowly and deliberately, and walked toward the counter. Xavier Shaw walked to the counter, his steps steady but deliberate, each one measured to counter the judgment in the air. As he approached, he noticed Officer Daniels glance up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. The small-town cop didn't stand up, didn't acknowledge Xavier's presence directly, but his gaze lingered, sharp and calculating, like a predator watching its prey. Xavier made eye contact with Daniels, his posture unwavering, his face calm. He dealt with men like this before, men who saw success in someone like him as an anomaly, a challenge to their worldview. There was always a thinly veiled suspicion in their eyes, as if they couldn't quite believe that someone like him, a black man, had earned his place at the table. And that unsettled them. The counter was an odd intersection of power dynamics. Xavier had the kind of wealth and influence most people in this town couldn't imagine. But that didn't seem to matter here. To Daniels and the others, He was still just a stranger, a black man in their town, challenging their norms. He could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing in on him, but he didn't flinch. He ordered his food from the counter, speaking with the same calm composure he'd perfected over the years of navigating spaces where people expected him to apologize for his existence. The waitress, though polite, couldn't hide the discomfort in her voice. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked, not quite meeting his gaze. Her fingers shook slightly as she wrote down his order. Xavier knew the routine. It was the same everywhere he went, though here, it felt more pronounced, more naked in its obviousness. There was the polite but guarded tone, the avoidance of eye contact, the subtle shift in the way people positioned themselves in relation to him. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was used to it. But the cumulative effect of these small moments always left a sting. "I'll have the burger, please," he said, his voice steady, measured. "No cheese, just lettuce and tomato." The waitress hesitated for a second before nodding. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Xavier sensed her struggle to place him in her mental framework. Was he here for business? Did he belong? She didn't seem convinced, but she gave a tight-lipped smile before retreating to the kitchen. As Xavier settled into his seat, the murmurs around him started up again. This time, they weren't even trying to hide it. He could hear fragments of conversations floating through the air, like poisoned arrows meant to take him down without ever confronting him directly. A man sitting 2 booths down, his fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Don't know what a guy like that's doing in here," he muttered, just loud enough for Xavier to catch it. "Probably just passing through." Xavier's jaw tightened. He could feel the undercurrent of judgment flowing through the room. Probably just passing through. The words stung, the assumption that he didn't belong here, in this small diner, this small town. Xavier took a deep breath, leaning back in the booth. It wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of treatment, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But there was something about the way it was happening here that made it feel more personal, more invasive, as though he wasn't being judged just for his appearance, but for his very right to exist in this space at all. He let the moment pass, his gaze flickering to the door. The quiet hum of the diner, the clink of silverware, and the muted conversations blended together, creating a strange dissonance. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a brief moment of clarity. He wasn't here for this. He wasn't here to fight some ignorant cop's assumption about him. He was here because he had a larger mission, one that would shake the very foundation of everything this town stood for. His food arrived, and Xavier took a moment to gather himself before digging in. The burger was exactly what he expected. Simple, nothing extraordinary. It tasted a little too dry for his liking, but he didn't care. As he ate, the weight of the room pressed on him again. Daniels had turned in his seat, and now he was watching Xavier, his eyes never straying too far, like a hawk following its prey. Xavier remained calm. He had worked too hard to let moments like these throw him off balance, but the frustration simmered just beneath the surface. His life had been built on a foundation of discipline, composure, and control. Yet, in moments like this, he wondered if any of it mattered, when people like Daniels could look at him and see nothing but a threat. It wasn't about his accomplishments, his wealth, or his company. It was about his skin. To them, that was the most defining feature of who he was. As he finished his meal, the tension seemed to grow in the air. The murmurs had shifted from whispered comments to more openly hostile judgments. Xavier couldn't ignore it anymore. He could feel their eyes on him, studying him like an exhibit in a zoo. The whispers were louder now, coming from a group of men sitting by the window, their voices tinged with both suspicion and amusement. "Maybe he'll just head back to the big city where he belongs," one of them said. "He's not going to get far here." Xavier's grip on his napkin tightened. Where he belongs. The phrase echoed in his mind, and for the first time that day, the calm demeanor began to crack. He knew exactly what they meant. To them, people like him didn't belong here, not in their town, not in their diner, not in their world. But instead of responding, instead of confronting them or lashing out as he wanted to, Xavier did what he always did. He stood up, calm and measured, and walked toward the counter. The small bell above the door jingled as he passed through it, and the sudden, almost oppressive silence that followed him felt deafening. Officer Daniels's eyes tracked Xavier's every movement. His body language, subtle as it was, stiffened, as if expecting some kind of confrontation. But Xavier didn't offer him the satisfaction. He paid for his meal, and with the same unshaken composure, he made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him, the sudden contrast to the warm, stuffy atmosphere of the diner sharpening his senses. The sun was setting now, the light fading fast, but Xavier didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had come to Millbrooke with a purpose, and while the tension in the diner was only a glimpse of the broader battle that awaited him, it was enough to ignite something deep within him. The small-town biases, the condescending glances, the whispers, they would have to change. And Xavier was ready to push back, even if it meant confronting those who had the power to overlook him, dismiss him, and judge him based on nothing but the color of his skin. As he walked to his car, the weight of the diner's judgment followed him. It gnawed at him, though he kept it locked away, buried under his calm exterior. Xavier Shaw had come to Millbrooke to do more than just challenge the assumptions of a few small-minded people. He was here to confront a system that had ignored him for too long, a system that had been built to hold people like him back. And he wouldn't stop until it was broken. The cold air bit into Xavier Shaw's skin as he stepped out of the diner and into the fading daylight. He felt the weight of the glances that followed him, the tension in the air still palpable, as if the very town was holding its breath. Every step he took toward his car felt like a calculated move in a game that had already been rigged against him. But Xavier knew better than to give in to the pressure. He'd built his life on fighting against the odds, on proving people wrong. And now, even in this small town, he would show them that he wouldn't be intimidated, no matter the looks or whispers. But as he reached his car, something stopped him. A car screeched to a halt in front of him, the tires squealing against the pavement. Xavier didn't have to turn around to know who it was, Officer Daniels. "Mr. Shaw," Daniels said, his voice tight, the words almost like a challenge. "I need to speak with you." Xavier froze. His instinct was to keep walking, to get into his car and drive away from the suffocating atmosphere of Millbrooke. But something in Daniels' tone, something off about the way he spoke, made him stop. He turned slowly, his face a mask of composure, masking the unease that began to grow in his gut. "What is this about, Officer Daniels?" Xavier asked, his voice calm, measured, but with a quiet steel behind it. He knew what this was. He could feel it. Daniels stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took a long look at Xavier. There was an uncomfortable silence before Daniels spoke again, his tone carrying a subtle menace. "I'm afraid there's been an incident," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "We've had complaints people saw you inside the diner. Some of the locals are upset by your presence here." Xavier felt his jaw tighten. His hand gripped the handle of his car door, the sleek surface cold beneath his fingers. He couldn't believe it. He'd expected the whispers, the sideways glances, but this was different. This wasn't about rumors anymore. This was about an attempt to put him in his place. "You're arresting me over complaints?" Xavier's voice was steady, but the anger began to rise in his chest, bubbling just beneath the surface. Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, towering over Xavier, his hands twitching at his sides as if ready to move into action. "People in this town don't take too kindly to outsiders," Daniels said, his eyes never leaving Xavier's. "You should have known that before you walked in." Xavier's mind raced. He could feel the blood rising to his cheeks, but he knew better than to let it show. He'd worked too hard to stay composed, to show people like Daniels that he wasn't just some outsider who could be dismissed, but this was a line he couldn't just let slide. He wasn't here to fight for his right to exist in a diner. He was here because Millbrooke was the epicenter of something much bigger than a few small-minded townsfolk. He was here because he knew that change, real change, had to start somewhere. "I'm not going anywhere," Xavier said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You have no right to detain me." Daniels's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. The tension between them hung thick in the air. Around them, the parking lot had grown quiet, the few people milling about suddenly taking notice of the confrontation. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Daniels growled, his hand moving to his belt as if to adjust something. Xavier's heart skipped a beat. Was he about to make a move? Was he going to arrest him right here, right now? Xavier didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his mind racing through every scenario. This wasn't just an ordinary cop. This was a man who had power in this town, a man who could manipulate the system to his advantage. And if Xavier wasn't careful, this moment could turn into something far uglier, but he wasn't afraid. He had learned to control his fear, to channel it into something more productive. "I've done nothing wrong, officer," Xavier said, his voice calm but sharp. "If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not going to work. You're wasting both of our time." For a moment, Daniels didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at Xavier as if trying to size him up, figure out how he would react. The silence stretched, and Xavier could feel the growing tension, the anticipation in the air, like a storm about to break. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. Daniels straightened, taking a step back. But Xavier could see the disappointment in his eyes, the way his posture shifted to something more rigid, more authoritative. And Xavier realized in that moment that this wasn't about what had happened in the diner. This wasn't even about him. This was about something bigger. A system that had already decided who deserved respect and who didn't. "You think this is over?" Daniels said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can come into this town, walk into that diner, and just demand respect? That's not how it works here." Xavier's resolve hardened. Demand respect. That's exactly what he was doing, and it was a damn shame that he had to fight for it. He took a deep breath, letting the anger roll off him like water, focusing on the bigger picture. There was no way Daniels could stop him. Not here. Not now. "I don't need to demand anything," Xavier replied, his voice quieter now, but with an edge that made Daniels pause. "But I will stand for what's right, and you'll see just how much of a fight you've picked. Officer Millbrooke can't keep running from its problems forever. You've made a mistake if you think I'm going to back down." With those words, Xavier stepped away, his hand on the door handle of his car, ready to leave this tense standoff behind. But before he could open it, Daniels spoke again. "You've been warned, Mr. Shaw," he called out, his voice harsh, more of a threat now than a plea. "Don't think you're above the law just because you have money and power." Xavier didn't respond. He didn't need to. He climbed into his car and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the quiet parking lot. The engine roared to life, and with a quick glance at Daniels in the rearview mirror, Xavier sped off. As he drove, his mind raced, piecing together the conversation, the threats, the implications of what had just happened. The tensions in the town were high, and it was clear now that this was no accident. Officer Daniels was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Something bigger was at play here, something that Xavier had suspected, but now knew for certain. Millbrooke wasn't just a town with a few small-minded people, it was a place where systemic corruption ran deep, where people like him weren't supposed to be here, weren't supposed to be thriving, succeeding. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Daniels wasn't just targeting him. He was protecting something. Maybe it was the status quo. Maybe it was the influence of a few powerful people who saw Xavier's presence as a threat to their grip on power. Either way, Xavier knew this was only the beginning. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he turned a corner and headed down a darker road. He was done playing it safe. He wasn't about to let some petty cop dictate how he could live his life, let alone how his company was going to change the world. This fight wasn't just about Millbrooke anymore. It was about something bigger, a systemic rot that had festered for far too long, and Xavier had every intention of doing something about it. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies. He needed someone who could help him navigate the deeper layers of corruption. He needed a plan, and he was about to make the first call that would change everything. The drive away from Millbrooke felt like an escape, but Xavier knew it was only temporary. The tension that had simmered throughout his visit now bubbled to the surface. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he sped down the empty highway, the faint rumble of the engine echoing in the silence. He had been given a glimpse of something much bigger than a small-town cop trying to put him in his place. It wasn't just Officer Daniels. It wasn't just about this one confrontation. It was about something deeper, more insidious. A system that had been built to exclude people like him. Xavier couldn't ignore the way the townsfolk had looked at him. The suspicion, the barely hidden disdain, He had lived long enough to recognize it. He had been living with it all his life. He had felt it when he entered a boardroom full of white executives who doubted his worth before he even opened his mouth. He had felt it in the halls of prestigious universities, the glances, the whispered comments. But Millbrooke, this town, it was something else. This was personal. And now, the true fight was about to begin. As he passed the exit for Millbrooke, Xavier's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Mitchell, one of the few people he trusted outside of his business. Mitchell was a fellow advocate for social justice, someone who understood the world Xavier was fighting against. They'd been talking about systemic change for years, but now, things were different. Now, the fight was real. Mitchell, they're talking about you on the radio. Officer Daniels filed a report. They're calling you a troublemaker for making people uncomfortable in that diner. Xavier clenched his jaw, the fire building inside him. He knew this was coming. He knew Daniels would try to make him the scapegoat. But the anger that surged in him wasn't just about the personal attack. It was about the system that was going to twist the truth, distort his actions, and label him as the villain again. He pulled over to the side of the road, his phone in hand. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he read the rest of the message. Mitchell, you need to come back here. They're spreading lies. We need to expose what's going on. People are scared. This town's got deep roots, and they're all tied up in that corruption. You can't let them win this time. Xavier's mind raced, exposing the corruption. That was exactly what he needed. He couldn't just back down now. Not when everything he'd worked for had led him to this moment. He couldn't let Daniels, or anyone else, paint him as a villain. The stakes were higher than they seemed. Xavier didn't respond to Mitchell immediately. He didn't need to. His decision was already made. He was going back. He would confront Daniels, and he would expose everything he had to. Xavier pulled back onto the road, heading straight for Millbrooke. The sun had set, but there was no turning back now. The weight of what was at stake pressed down on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. This was about standing up for everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins, excluded from spaces that should have been theirs. The small-town streets of Millbrooke looked almost alien now. The lights from the street lamps cast long shadows across the sidewalk, but Xavier's focus was unwavering. As he approached the center of town, he saw the flashing lights of a police car parked in front of the local courthouse. Xavier's stomach twisted. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, the kind that came when something wasn't right. He slowed his car and pulled over to the curb a block away. He sat for a moment, the hum of the engine filling the silence, before his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Mitchell. Xavier, they've got you pinned as a troublemaker, Mitchell's voice crackled through the line. I just spoke to someone downtown. The mayor's office is involved. This is bigger than we thought. Daniels isn't just protecting the town's reputation, he's working with someone behind the scenes. Xavier's heart pounded. The realization hit him like a slap in the face. The entire system, the entire town was compromised. He wasn't just fighting Officer Daniels, he was fighting a network of people who had allowed this place to stay in its status quo for years, decades even. I need to confront them, Xavier said, his voice sharp. This ends tonight. You can't go in blind, Mitchell warned, his voice strained. They're trying to paint you as the enemy. If you go in there without a plan. I don't need a plan, I just need to make sure they know I'm not backing down. Xavier hung up, his resolve growing stronger by the second. He stepped out of the car and walked briskly toward the courthouse. He didn't know what he was about to face, but he knew he couldn't let them silence him. The town might not understand him now, but they would. They had to. As Xavier neared the courthouse, the doors swung open, and Officer Daniels emerged with the mayor at his side. The mayor's face was red, his expression tight with frustration. The moment he saw Xavier approaching, he stopped in his tracks. The look in his eyes was one of recognition that Xavier was no longer the outsider, the troublemaker, the unwanted. Now, Xavier was a threat, and they would do anything to silence him. Mr. Shaw, the mayor said, his tone clipped. I'd suggest you turn around and leave this town before things get any more difficult for you. Xavier didn't flinch. He stood taller, his gaze unyielding. I'm not leaving. Not until I get the truth out there. Not until everyone knows what's really going on in Millbrooke. The mayor's lips curled into a sneer, and Daniels stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and suffocating. "Listen, Shaw," Daniels said, his voice low, dangerous. "You've made your point. You don't belong here. This town's not the place for your kind, and you know it. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Xavier's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't back down. He knew what Daniels was doing. He was trying to bait him, trying to get him to react so they could escalate the situation further, but Xavier's mind was clear, his purpose more defined than ever. "I'm not going anywhere," Xavier said, his voice cold, cutting through the tension. "This town is going to change, whether you like it or not, and I'm not leaving until I make sure everyone knows how deep this corruption goes." A tense silence hung in the air for a long moment. Daniel's hand twitched near his gun, and Xavier could feel his pulse quicken. He had never been this close to danger, but his resolve didn't falter. He had a bigger mission, and he wouldn't let anyone stop him now, not even Officer Daniels. "I don't want to make a scene," Xavier said, his voice low but forceful. "But I will, if I have to." The mayor exchanged a look with Daniels, and for a moment, it seemed like the two of them were trying to decide what to do next. Xavier took that moment to gather his thoughts, to assess the situation. He could feel it. The tipping point was close. The town had underestimated him, assumed he was just a man who didn't belong here. They had no idea what he was capable of. No idea how far he was willing to go to expose their corruption. And then, before anyone could make a move, Xavier made his decision. "I'm going to make a stand," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "This town will remember me." He turned on his heel and walked toward the courthouse doors, his heart pounding. He didn't know how this was going to play out, but it didn't matter. It was time to take action, to make the world see what was happening in Millbrooke. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. He was going to force their hand. Behind him, he heard the sound of Daniel's footsteps, the rustling of clothes as the mayor moved to follow. But Xavier didn't look back. This moment, this turning point, was his. He would either expose the truth or be crushed beneath it. There was no other option. This section ramps up the intensity and brings the conflict to a critical point. Xavier's confrontation with Officer Daniels and the mayor shows the systemic corruption at play, and Xavier's internal strength drives him to make a bold stand. The tension builds to a pivotal moment, setting the stage for the climactic confrontation in the next phase of the story. Let me know when you're ready for Prompt 6, where we will dive into the climactic moment and its aftermath. The cold stone of the courthouse steps felt oddly comforting beneath Xavier's boots as he marched forward. His heart pounded in his chest, but his steps were steady. He had reached the tipping point. No more avoiding the truth, no more giving in to the injustice that surrounded him. Officer Daniels and the corrupt network that held Millbrooke in its grip had underestimated him. But tonight, Xavier was going to show them all just how wrong they were. The doors to the courthouse loomed ahead, a gateway to the next chapter of his life. He had come here to expose the corruption that had kept this town and its people in chains for far too long. He wasn't going to leave until they saw him for who he was. Not just a wealthy black man in a small town, but a force of change they couldn't ignore. As Xavier reached the doors, Officer Daniels emerged from the shadows, his figure blocking the entryway. The cop's posture was stiff, his face betraying a hint of something darker. Fear, perhaps, or anger. But it was something else too. Something more insidious. He was used to dealing with men like Xavier, used to putting them in their place. And now, Xavier had made the mistake of challenging everything Daniels stood for. That was something Daniels couldn't let slide. "You think you're just going to walk in there, don't you?" Daniels said, his voice low, cold. He stepped forward, cutting off Xavier's path. "You don't belong here, and you're not going anywhere until we've had this conversation." Xavier stopped. His jaw tightened, but his eyes never left Daniels. There was a stillness about him, something calm that contrasted with the seething tension in the air. He could feel the weight of Daniels' presence, could hear the hum of the courthouse behind them. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, but Xavier was not afraid. "I've had enough of your games, Daniels," Xavier said, his voice steady and measured. "Enough of your lies, Enough of this charade. It's time for you to answer for what you've been doing in this town. It's time for everyone to see what's really been going on here." Daniel's lips curled into a sneer. "What do you think you're going to do? Expose the truth? You don't have a clue what you're dealing with. Millbrooke doesn't change. People like you don't change it. It stays the same always." Xavier could feel the bile rising in his throat, the anger building again, but he pushed it down. Daniels was not the problem. The system was the problem. And he needed to stay focused, needed to see this through. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been denied their voice, for every black man and woman who had been forced to live in the shadows. "People like me?" Xavier echoed, his voice now laced with steel. "You don't get it, do you, Daniels? I'm here to make sure Millbrooke changes, and I'm not walking away until it does." Daniels took a step closer, his body language hostile, but Xavier didn't flinch. He could feel the officer's contempt, but he stood tall, unwavering. They had reached the precipice. There was no going back now. "You've made a lot of noise, Shaw," Daniels said, his voice thick with disdain. "But you're not welcome here. Not now, not ever. You're a problem, and we don't tolerate problems in this town." Xavier's eyes narrowed. The cop's words were loaded with something more than mere judgment. They were a threat. But Daniels wasn't the only one who could play this game. Xavier had spent years learning how to navigate hostile environments, learning how to outwit those who thought they were better, more powerful, more entitled. He had learned how to expose corruption, how to turn the tide in his favor. Without saying another word, Xavier reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He didn't have to look at it. He knew what it contained. The evidence he'd gathered over the last few weeks, the documents, the recordings, the testimonies from people who had seen the truth but were too afraid to speak up. All of it was in that envelope, waiting for the right moment. He held it out to Daniels, his hand steady. "I think you'll find this interesting." Daniels looked at the envelope, then back at Xavier, clearly unfazed. He wasn't intimidated by a few papers. What could they possibly reveal? But as Daniels reached for it, Xavier spoke again. "This," Xavier said, his voice cutting through the air, "is your downfall. Everything you've been protecting, everything you've been covering up, it's all right here." For a moment, Daniels froze. His eyes flickered over the envelope, then back to Xavier, his face slowly turning red with the realization of what was at stake. His grip on the envelope tightened, and for the first time, the cop's cool exterior cracked. "You don't know what you're messing with," Daniels growled, his voice low. "You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not the one playing games here," Xavier shot back. "You've been playing them with everyone in this town, and now, the game is over." Daniels took a step back, glaring at Xavier, but the damage had been done. The officer knew the truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before it spread. The corruption Xavier had uncovered, the ties between local officials and the corrupt network that ran Millbrooke, were about to be exposed. Daniels had been too arrogant to realize that Xavier had been planning this all along. But the tension wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Daniels turned quickly, his hand shooting up to his radio. "I need backup," he barked into the device. "Get over here now." Xavier's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the words, but the tone, the desperation in Daniels' voice, that made him realize how far the officer was willing to go to keep the truth buried. This was bigger than Xavier. This was about power, and Daniels would do anything to maintain his. For a moment, Xavier hesitated. He knew this was the moment where the conflict would either resolve or escalate. He had made his stand, had exposed Daniels for what he was, but it wasn't over yet. If Daniels could stop him now, if the local officials got wind of what he was doing, they would squash him like a bug. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, the unmistakable wail of emergency vehicles that echoed through the empty streets. Backup. Xavier's mind raced. There wasn't much time. But in that moment, something in him clicked. He wasn't just going to stand there and wait to be overrun. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. He couldn't, not when so many lives were on the line. "I'm not waiting for your backup," Xavier said, his voice unwavering. "I've already won this. I've got what I need, and when the world finds out what you've been hiding, Daniels, you won't have a place to run." Before Daniels could respond, Xavier turned on his heel and walked into the courthouse, the doors swinging open behind him. The air inside was cool and sterile, but Xavier's mind was on fire. He had come this far, and now, the world would finally see the truth. Behind him, he could hear the pounding of footsteps. Daniels and his backup were coming, but Xavier didn't turn around. He couldn't waste another second. Every step he took in that building felt like a step closer to the truth, a step closer to bringing Millbrooke's rot into the light. But as he approached the courtroom, his heart skipped a beat. The doors to the chamber were closed, and he could hear voices inside. It was too quiet, too still. Something was wrong. He reached for the handle, and then the door swung open in front of him. Xavier's pulse raced as he stood in the empty courthouse hallway, the door to the courtroom looming ahead like an obstacle. The air felt thick with tension, almost suffocating. His hand gripped the envelope in his pocket, the evidence of the corruption in Millbrooke burning a hole through the fabric and the weight of what it could expose. He had made it this far. He couldn't stop now. He could hear the sirens from outside, the sound of officers rushing toward him, but he didn't move. His mind was focused on one thing. He was about to face the full force of the corruption he had been fighting against for weeks. Officer Daniels, the mayor, and the system that had kept this town entrenched in its biases were all going to feel the pressure now. The moment of truth had arrived. As he stepped forward, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. It was Daniels, and he wasn't alone. The unmistakable rush of police officers following their leader reverberated down the hall. "Stop right there, Shaw." Daniels's voice cut through the tension, rough and threatening. Xavier turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as Daniels and two other officers blocked his path. The cop's posture was rigid, the hard lines of his face betraying his frustration. He wasn't just angry now. He was desperate. Xavier could see it in his eyes. The kind of desperation that only came when someone realized they were about to lose everything. "I'm done playing nice," Daniels said, his voice low, venomous. "You've made a mess of this town, Shaw. You've made it personal. Now it's time to pay the price for that." Xavier's gaze hardened. "I'm not the one making it personal, Daniels. You've been playing this game for too long. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. It's about the truth. It's about what's right." Daniels stepped closer, the scent of stale coffee and sweat hanging in the air between them. He was now only a few feet away, and Xavier could feel the heat of his breath on his skin. He didn't back down. He couldn't. Not when everything he had fought for was on the line. "You don't know what you're messing with," Daniels spat, his hand hovering near his holster. "I've seen men like you try to bring us down before they don't last long. You're no different. You're just a flash in the pan. You'll burn out." Xavier's stomach churned with disgust, but he didn't let it show. This wasn't the time to let his emotions get the best of him. Daniels had already underestimated him, and now he was making the mistake of thinking he could intimidate Xavier with empty threats. "I'm not going anywhere," Xavier said, his voice unwavering. "This town will change. It's time people like you were held accountable for what they've done. The lies, the corruption. It ends today." For a moment, there was only silence. The officers around Daniels shifted uneasily, clearly unsure of what to do, but Daniels didn't budge. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Xavier, the anger mounting. "You really think this is over? You think you're going to walk in here and change things? You think you can expose us?" Daniels' voice was a snarl now. "You don't know the first thing about power, Shaw. This town is mine, and you'll leave when I say so." The other officers stood silently, watching the exchange unfold, but Xavier could sense their hesitation. Daniels was trying to maintain control, but he wasn't convincing anyone, not even his own people. Xavier knew this was his chance to turn the tables. "Power?" Xavier echoed. "What you call power is nothing but manipulation and fear. You've built this whole system on lies, but it's coming down. You can't stop it. Not now, not when the truth is out." Daniel's face twitched as the words sank in. The realization was clear. Xavier wasn't going to back down, and he wasn't going to stop. For a moment, Daniels looked like he might reach for his weapon, but something held him back. The officers with him were watching closely, their faces unreadable but tense. "I'll make sure you never leave this town," Daniels said, the venom in his voice unmistakable. "You think you've won. You think you've exposed us. We're the ones in control. You're nothing." Xavier held his ground. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, for every injustice that had been swept under the rug. He had the power now. The envelope in his pocket contained everything: the proof, the testimony, the recordings that would bring the truth into the light. "You're not in control anymore, Daniels," Xavier said firmly, pulling the envelope from his pocket and holding it up for the officer to see. "This is the end of the road for you." Daniels' eyes widened, his body stiffening as he realized what Xavier had in his hand. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the other officers, who were now visibly unsettled. For the first time, Daniels looked uncertain, and it was then that Xavier knew he had won. The evidence he held in his hand was the key to breaking the grip Daniels and the corrupt officials had on this town. This isn't over," Daniels said, his voice shaking now. "You don't know what you're messing with." Xavier shook his head. "No, Daniels. You don't know what you're dealing with. You've been hiding behind your badge, your power, your lies, but now everyone's going to see the truth, and you won't have anywhere left to run." Daniels' jaw clenched. "You think you've won? You think the mayor will let you?" "I don't need the mayor's approval," Xavier interrupted. "I've already contacted the state authorities. They're on their way." The realization of what that meant seemed to hit Daniels all at once. His face drained of color, and for a brief moment, he looked utterly defeated. His hand dropped from his holster, and his shoulders slumped slightly. You can't do this," Daniels said weakly. "You have no idea what you're about to unleash." "I know exactly what I'm unleashing," Xavier replied, his voice steady. "The truth." There was a moment of silence. The officers around Daniels shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Xavier's words settling in. They could see the shift in Daniels' posture, the way the authority he had once carried so confidently was slipping through his fingers. They could see it, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to choose stand with Daniels, or stand with the truth. "I'm done here," Xavier said, his voice final. "The truth will come out, Daniels, and you won't be able to stop it." With that, Xavier turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, every step resolute. Behind him, Daniels stood motionless, the weight of his corruption too heavy to ignore. The officers followed quietly, their footsteps hesitant. Xavier could feel the eyes on his back, but he didn't care. The battle had been fought, and he had won. The truth was in motion now, and no one, not Daniels, not the mayor, no one, could stop it. But as he reached for the door, something happened that made his heart stop. A voice from behind him. "Mr. Shaw." Xavier froze. The voice was different this time, calmer, but it carried an undeniable weight. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, as he saw who had spoken. It was Mitchell. His face was pale, his eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and urgency. The last thing Xavier had expected was for Mitchell to be here, and now, the uncertainty rushed back in full force. "What is it?" Xavier asked, his voice tense. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with something. His gaze flicked to Daniels and then back to Xavier, and in that moment, Xavier could feel the gravity of what was about to happen. I just got word. There's been a change in the plan." Xavier's heart pounded harder. He knew that Mitchell wasn't someone who panicked easily. But this was different. Something had shifted. "What do you mean?" Xavier pressed, stepping closer. Mitchell swallowed, his eyes darting around nervously. "The authorities, they're not coming. Someone's already paid them off. This isn't over. Not yet." Xavier's blood ran cold. The stakes were even higher than he thought. This section reaches the emotional and narrative peak, with Xavier taking a firm stand against Officer Daniels and exposing his corruption. The moment is intense, and Xavier's strategic thinking and resilience shine through as he confronts Daniels and the corrupt system. The stakes are raised even higher as Mitchell reveals that the authorities may not be coming as expected, leaving Xavier facing an even more dangerous situation. This moment of uncertainty sets the stage for the next phase of the story. Let me know when you're ready for Prompt 8, where we can explore the resolution and aftermath. Xavier stood motionless, as Mitchell's words echoed in his mind, his stomach twisting with uncertainty. The authorities weren't coming. The system he thought he had set in motion, the evidence he had gathered, the plan he had carefully laid out, everything was in jeopardy. Someone had paid off the officials, had sabotaged the one piece of leverage he had left. It was a sobering realization. The fight he had started was far from over. Mitchell's face was pale, a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not sure how they did it, but someone powerful made sure that the state won't be stepping in today, Daniels. He's not the end of this." Xavier's mind raced. He had been so sure, he had thought, that once the truth came to light, things would shift, that the power he'd worked so hard to uncover would make all the difference. But now, the realization hit him. Power wasn't just in evidence or truth. It was in the people who controlled the system, and it wasn't just one corrupt officer or one crooked politician. It was a whole network that needed to be dismantled. "I don't have time to waste," Xavier muttered, his voice low but filled with resolve. "If they think this ends with me walking out of here, they've got another thing coming." Mitchell hesitated, but then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Xavier took a deep breath, calming his racing thoughts. There had to be another way to bring the truth to the surface, even if the state wasn't coming through. The evidence he carried was still the key. It was a start, but he needed more. He needed the people of Millbrooke to see what had been happening behind closed doors. He needed the power of the community on his side. "I'm going back to the people," Xavier said. "I'm going to make sure they see what Daniels and the others have been hiding. If they think they can silence me, they're wrong." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "What about Daniels and his backup?" "I'll deal with them, but first, I'm going to take the fight to the people. If I can get them on my side, we can expose everything. We'll have the power to force the changes that need to happen. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." Xavier and Mitchell left the courthouse, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on Xavier's shoulders, but there was no turning back now. He was already committed to this fight, no matter what it cost him. They didn't say much as they walked through the quiet streets of Millbrooke. The town had always felt like a place of memories, a place that had shaped him into who he was today. But now, it felt different. It felt like a battleground. As they reached the town square, Xavier saw the familiar faces of the townspeople milling about. The small shops, the corner bakery, the cafe he had visited earlier, they were all still here, the same as they had always been. But now, it wasn't just the peaceful rhythms of small-town life that filled the air. It was uncertainty, tension. The people had heard the whispers, seen the unrest, and they needed to know the truth. Xavier walked into the middle of the square, drawing the attention of those around him. The murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He didn't waste a moment. He stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful, carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "People of Millbrooke," Xavier began, his words loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've come here today to tell you the truth. The truth about what's been happening behind closed doors in this town, the lies that have been fed to you, the corruption that has poisoned this place." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Some looked at him with disbelief, others with curiosity, but Xavier could see it in their eyes, the fear, the hesitation. They didn't know whether to trust him. They didn't know if they should stand with him. But Xavier wasn't asking for their trust, he was asking for their action. "The system you've trusted is broken," he continued, his voice unwavering. "I've gathered the evidence, the proof of the corruption that's been festering in this town for years. But that's not enough. I need you, each and every one of you, to stand up. Stand up for the truth. Stand up for what's right." Xavier paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. He could see the uncertainty still in their eyes, but there was something else too. Something that hadn't been there before. It was the beginning of a shift. People were starting to listen. The seed of change had been planted. "I know some of you are afraid," Xavier said, his voice gentler now. "I know that standing up to the system isn't easy, but we have a choice. We can either continue to live in fear, or we can fight back. We can't let people like Officer Daniels and the others dictate how we live. We can take control of our future, And it starts right here, right now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others stood uncertain, but the message was clear. They were listening, and they were ready to act. The hours that followed were a blur of energy, momentum building with every conversation, every rallying cry. Xavier and Mitchell worked together, gathering allies, speaking to those who were ready to stand with him. It wasn't easy. There were skeptics, people who feared retribution, people who had been too broken by the system to believe in change. But the truth had a way of cutting through the noise. By evening, the crowd had grown. More and more people gathered in the town square, a mixture of quiet hope and simmering frustration in the air. Xavier could feel the power of the community building around him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been ignored, silenced, or excluded. This was about giving them a voice. At some point, Daniels and the other officers showed up, no longer the confident figures they had been earlier. They stood at the edge of the crowd, their eyes scanning for any signs of trouble, but Xavier wasn't worried about them. He had the people now. They couldn't intimidate him anymore. He took the stage, speaking one final time to the crowd. "This town has been run by fear, by corruption, for far too long," he said, his voice booming across the square. "But we can change it, we can rise above it. Together, we will force the system to change, we'll expose the truth, and we'll make sure that justice is done." The crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't over, but it was a victory. It was the first real crack in the foundation of the system that had kept Millbrooke captive. As the evening wore on, Xavier felt a quiet sense of accomplishment wash over him, but there was no time to rest. The road ahead would be difficult, and there were still people in power who wouldn't give up easily, but he knew this was just the beginning. He had made his stand. And now, Millbrooke was awake. They were no longer going to let the system control them. The final twist of the evening came as Xavier was walking back to his car. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his expression grim but resigned. The officers behind him stayed in the distance, watching quietly. "You won," Daniels said, his voice low. "But don't think this is over. You've exposed us, but there's more to this than you realize, and we're not done yet." Xavier met Daniels' gaze, but this time, there was no fear, no hesitation in his eyes. "You've already lost, Daniels," Xavier said calmly. "You're part of a system that's broken, and the truth has already been set in motion. There's no stopping it now." With that, Xavier turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the town square. Behind him, Daniels and the officers remained silent, powerless in the face of the truth Xavier had brought to light. Xavier didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. Millbrooke was changing, and he was part of that change.